I hadn't stood on that driveway in 5 years, not since I left with my dreams stuffed in a single suitcase and a stomach full of silence. But here I was again. Same cracked stones beneath my feet, same smug laughter echoing from inside, the grand estate. Only this time, I wasn't the girl they used to mock. Still, I parked around the corner, didn't want them seeing the car, the same one I'd driven in college, not out of shame, but because sometimes people don't deserve the full truth until the right moment. I held the box tighter in my hands. It was simple, hand-wrapped in brown paper with a navy ribbon. Inside was a book, first edition, the one Dad always said he wanted but never found. It wasn't about the gift. It was about what it meant to remember, even when others forget. You. My phone buzzed. Tasha. I could hear the concern in her voice even before I answered. Please tell me you didn't actually go. I gave a half smile. Too late. Already walking toward the lion's den. She sighed. Ellie. You owe them nothing. You built yourself from dust. They didn't even notice. I know, I said, and I meant it. But this wasn't about them noticing. It was about me knowing. The front door swung open before I even reached the steps, and there she was. Diana. My stepmother, hair perfect, smile sharp. She looked me up and down, the way you'd glance at something spilled on marble. Oh, she said, too brightly. You came. Then she noticed the gift. Her tone dipped. Is that from a store? I just nodded. Behind her, the living room buzzed with wealthy chatter, clinking glasses, polished shoes, familiar strangers. I stepped in, and it felt like walking into a memory I didn't ask to relive. My half-brother Chase saw me first. He was by the fireplace, surrounded by his corporate clone friends. He smirked. Well, look who decided to crawl back from her little garage startup, he muttered to the group, just loud enough. Then louder. This party is for family, not charity cases. Laughter. I felt it, that old burn behind my ribs, but I said nothing. I just kept walking, until a hand on my shoulder, firm, uniformed. Ma'am, the security guard said, I'm gonna need you to come with me. Guests turned. Whispers slithered through the room. Who is she again? Did she really think that car belonged here? Poor thing. I followed the guard through the front hallway, down the steps, until we reached the gravel. He raised his radio. Escorted subject off premises, situation contained, and just as I stepped off the porch, another guard came jogging over. New face, eyes sharp. He looked at me, really looked. Then his voice broke into the air. Wait, ma'am, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. He turned to the other guard. Stand down, immediately. The first guard blinked. But she was, that's Madam CEO, the second one said. He turned back to me. Apologies, Ms. Monroe. Your name's on the security clearance list, priority level. There was a pause. It was like the whole house stopped breathing, and I just stood there, still holding the gift they laughed at. I didn't say a word. Didn't need to, because in that moment, they all realized I wasn't the poor girl who left. I was the woman they'd learned to regret crossing. And that was just the beginning. There's a kind of silence that only daughters know. The one that sits in a room full of family, but still feels cold. That was my childhood. Not poor, at least not in the material sense, but lacking something far deeper, acknowledgement. I was Dad's only child from his first marriage. My mother passed when I was 8. I don't remember the funeral as much as I remember what came after. The way Delia entered our lives like a gust of perfume and judgment. She was everything my mother wasn't. Polished, wealthy, impossibly perfect. And I was the smudge she couldn't scrub out of the family portrait. She never said anything outright. It was more subtle than that. Like when she'd rearranged the dinner table and I'd suddenly find myself seated 2 chairs down. Or when she'd talk about real potential, and her eyes would drift over me like I wasn't in the room. And then came Cameron, her golden boy. My half-brother. He was charming in the way spoiled people learn to be when the world hands them everything before they've earned anything. Even as kids, he made it clear I didn't belong in his version of this family. By the time I graduated college, I had one thing, an idea. It wasn't flashy, just a simple startup focused on digital logistics for small businesses. I remember sitting at that long dining table, nervously sliding the pitch deck across to Dad. My hands were shaking. Delia didn't even glance at the folder. She just sipped her wine and said, "Sweetheart, not everyone's meant to be an entrepreneur." Cameron laughed, not loud, but just enough to land. He said something like, "Cute idea, but Dad's got real investments to focus on." And then Dad. He gave me that soft, rehearsed smile, the kind people use when they're about to disappoint you gently. He placed his hand on mine and said, "Maybe you're not built for business the way Cameron is. And that's okay. You're different. Different." That word wrapped itself around my ribs and stayed there. I left that night with my dreams in one hand and my pride in the other. Tasha picked me up from the curb. I hadn't even asked. She just showed up, like she always did. She drove me back to our shoebox apartment and said, "They'll regret this. One day, they'll regret everything." I wanted to believe her, but for a long time, I couldn't afford to hope. I worked nights, handled cold emails during bus rides, lived off instant noodles and energy drinks. No one knew the nights I cried into spreadsheets, the times I stared at my bank balance, wondering if I'd have to give up. And then there was the betrayal I didn't see coming. Cameron showed up at a pitch event, slick suit, too much cologne, and my words coming out of his mouth. Not all of them. Just enough. Enough to impress a client from Dad's firm. I confronted him, cornered him outside the venue, heart pounding. He didn't even deny it, just smirked and said, "Maybe you should protect your files better when..." I told Dad. He shrugged, said it was probably a coincidence, that Cameron had always been business-minded. That was the moment I stopped being their daughter and started being my own weapon. Sometimes the deepest betrayal doesn't happen in one moment. It's a slow leak, so quiet, so subtle. You don't even realize you're drowning until you're halfway under. By the time I built my company, I didn't even use my last name, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to see who'd believe in the product without knowing the bloodline behind it. It started in a co-working space downtown. One laptop, one foldable desk. Me and a stubborn belief that function and sustainability could live in the same room. I never told Tasha this, but I used to rehearse fake phone calls in the early days, just so the room wouldn't feel so quiet, just so I'd feel seen. Years passed. And slowly, the world began to see what I saw. Investors came, clients multiplied, but I stayed quiet. No articles, no interviews, no Forbes list. I wasn't building fame. I was building freedom. And then, one quiet morning over coffee, the name West & Co. showed up in a finance blog. At first I thought it was just a slip, a poorly performing quarter maybe. But the deeper I read, the more it felt like a pattern. Back-to-back losses, sudden layoffs, internal restructuring. The same firm that once told me I wasn't built for business was rotting from the inside out. I stared at the screen. For a long time, and somewhere underneath the calm, I felt it. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Just curiosity. I forwarded the article to Marcus, an old mentor from my internship days at West & Co., back when I was the coffee girl with ideas no one heard. We hadn't spoken in years, but he replied within an hour. His message was short. Just one sentence. "You're asking the right questions, Ellie. Be careful who's answering them." We met 2 days later at a quiet rooftop bar he liked. He looked older, but not weaker. There was always something calculating in his eyes, not cruel, just aware. He glanced at me over his drink and said, "Your brother's been bleeding the firm slowly for years. Your father doesn't see it, or won't." I asked him how long he'd known. "Long enough," he said, "but I needed proof, and I figured you might want it first." He slid a folder across the table. Old school. No digital trail. Inside were transaction records, falsified invoices, emails that reeked of arrogance. It was Cameron, embezzling, rerouting funds through ghost vendors and overbilled services. Sat there, reading line after line, and suddenly, old memories came flooding back. The tension I used to feel in board meetings, even as an intern. The files that had mysteriously disappeared from my desktop. The way Cameron had smiled the day I was let go, framed as budget cuts. I closed the folder slowly. "That's not even the worst of it," Marcus added. I looked up. "He's trying to sell off part of the company's legacy assets under the table. If he succeeds, there's no coming back." I didn't say anything, not because I was shocked, but because somewhere deep down, I'd been expecting this. When rot starts at the root, it just takes time for the branches to collapse. Back at my office, I found Erin, one of our junior project leads, working late. She was young, driven, always respectful. I asked her. Casually, where she worked before this, she smiled. "West & Co., actually. Just a summer internship." Something in me paused. I asked if anything ever felt off. Her expression changed. "There were things," she said carefully. "Invoices that didn't match, vendors that didn't exist. But when I brought it up, they told me I was just confused." She hesitated, then added, "Cameron once told me, 'You're smart, but not smart enough to understand the big picture.'" I thanked her, walked out of her office, closed the door, and just stood there, alone in the hallway, surrounded by something I built with bruised hands and sleepless nights, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the fire again. Not the kind that burns everything down, but the kind that sharpens steel. I went home that night and stared at my ceiling for hours. Part of me wanted to expose him, leak everything, watch the press rip him apart like wolves. But the other part of me, the colder part, it wanted something quieter, something lasting. Because revenge isn't loud, it's patient and surgical. It's looking someone in the eye and watching the moment they realize they underestimated you for the last time. Revenge doesn't come with a warning. It doesn't storm the gates or light the sky on fire. It waits, it listens, and when it finally arrives, it whispers. The night I decided to take West & Co., I didn't sleep, not out of excitement, but clarity. It was like my mind had been sharpening itself for years. I wasn't going to scream or plead or prove myself anymore. I was going to buy them and bury them with their own secrets. Step one was control, not attention. Control. I started small, buying shares through 3 shell companies, each set up under different regions and silent investors. Nothing flashy, nothing to spook the board. Marcus helped orchestrate it. He introduced me to a contact named Mason, a quiet, meticulous accountant who'd once been fired from West & Cordes for underperformance. What really happened? He'd always flagged some inconsistencies, the same ones Cameron buried. When I first met Mason, he didn't smile much. He kept his answers short, measured. But after I slid the signed agreement across the table with a generous retainer, he finally said, "I've been waiting years for someone to pull that thread." Tasha was the only one who knew what I was doing in real time. I remember sitting on my apartment floor, surrounded by files and numbers, when she asked, "Are you sure you want to do this quietly? You could burn them in the press overnight." I looked at her and said, "They want a headline. I want a legacy." Once we secured enough shares to hold a whisper of power, just enough to attend board meetings through a proxy, I moved to phase 2, rot the image. Aaron connected me with a freelance journalist named Callie, someone who believed in exposing corporate corruption. I fed her harmless but embarrassing truths: a shipment mismanaged, an HR complaint ignored, a diversity scandal buried, nothing that would implode the company, but enough to make the public squint. And they did. Stock dipped, investors flinched. Cameron went on a local business podcast and blamed a coordinated smear campaign from competitors. I almost laughed when I watched it, because he wasn't entirely wrong. Meanwhile, I had Lena, my corporate attorney, prepping something much sharper. She was young, surgical, and absolutely terrifying in heels. The first time I showed her Cameron's falsified vendor lists and internal emails, she simply nodded and said, "Get me bank records. We'll thread the noose from there." That's when Mason came in again. He'd kept everything, every discrepancy, every forgery, and there it was. Cameron's signature. Over and over and over. We built the case like a sniper builds a shot, slow, deliberate, and precise. But even the best-laid plans have cracks. One afternoon, Cameron called me, out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken in years. His number popping up on my phone made my stomach turn. He sounded casual, too casual. "Hey, I heard you've been dabbling in the market lately. West & Comer's ring a bell?" I paused, just long enough to raise suspicion, not alarm. Then I said, "Just testing the waters, like you tested my patience, remember?" He laughed awkwardly and said something like, "Well, if you're thinking of investing, don't. We're dealing with some temporary turbulence." I smiled. Turbulence is survivable. Crashes aren't. Then I hung up. But I knew after that call. He was watching, so I tightened everything. No more direct communications. Everything routed through proxies. Marcus started feeding misinformation into board meetings, just enough to distract Cameron. He chased fake leads while we built the real trap. Lena filed the preliminary reports under sealed names. Mason encrypted the paper trail. And I did what I always did. Stayed invisible, but the part that kept me up the most was my father. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't know, that he was being manipulated, that somewhere under all the years of silence, he still saw me as something more than a shadow. But then I found the letter, an old one, tucked in the back of a legal folder Mason recovered from the archives. It was from my father, to Cameron, dated 2 years ago. It read, "Keep things clean. If Ellie ever tries to make noise, we'll deal with her quietly. She never had the stomach for real business anyway." I read it 3 times, every word slicing through whatever hope I had left. They didn't just fail me, they chose to. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I finished the plan. Within 2 months, the company was collapsing from within. Lena filed the public disclosure through the Financial Crimes Unit. Callie ran a front-page exposé. Cameron's face was everywhere, shaking, cornered, exposed. And the board? They had no idea what hit them. But I wasn't done yet, because some scars deserve a final cut. I bought the estate, the same one where they laughed at my gift, where I stood on the gravel with a paper-wrapped box in my hand, listening to whispers. It was listed quietly, desperate sale to cover legal debts. I didn't change anything about it. Same furniture, same garden, same gate. But this time, the security team worked for me. When the paperwork finalized, Gerald, the head of security, shook my hand and said, "Funny how life comes around, isn't it?" I smiled and replied, "Not funny, just fair." Now, sometimes I walk through those halls at night, past the same family portraits, the same outdated wallpaper. But now, it's mine. And in the silence, I don't hear their laughter anymore. I hear my own. Poetic justice doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't need revenge speeches or dramatic exits. It just arrives, right on time. The estate looked almost identical to the night they humiliated me. Same chandeliers, same scent of old money and expensive denial. But this time, the name on the deed was mine. I hosted the meeting in the same ballroom where they'd laughed at my gift. The irony tasted better than champagne. The invitation said, "Corporate Transition Briefing." Formal, urgent, vague enough to keep them guessing. They came dressed in arrogance. Delia, in a cream suit that cost more than my first 3 months of rent. Cameron, jaw tight, tie perfect, still thinking he could talk his way out of anything. And my father? Older, thinner, still carrying that tired smile like a mask. Security met them at the door. One of the new guards, the one who once apologized for the mistake, looked at me and said, "Welcome back, Madam CEO." Just loud enough for them to hear. Cameron's smirk cracked, just slightly. Inside the ballroom, everything was set. Rows of seats, a podium, and a screen. I stood at the front, calm, collected, as the room filled with whispers. They didn't recognize me at first. Not until I cleared my throat and stepped into the light. "My name," I said slowly, "is Eleanor Monroe, and as of this morning, I am the majority shareholder and legal owner of Weston Koinarisian Silence." Then confusion. Then disbelief. Cameron stood up. "This is a joke, right? Some kind of PR stunt?" I nodded toward the projector. The slideshow clicked on, page after page. Bank transfers, falsified invoices, signed documents, his signature glowing on every screen. "You didn't just steal from a company, Cameron," I said, steady as stone. "You stole from your family. And now, I'm taking it back," Delia gasped. My father tried to stand, but the weight of the moment pinned him to the chair. "This," I turned to him, "was your legacy. You handed it to a thief." I let the last slide sit in silence, a still frame of Cameron shaking hands with a fake vendor. And then security moved. 2 guards approached him. He stepped back, shouting, "You can't do this! I built this company." I raised an eyebrow. "No, you looted it. I built mine. From nothing." He didn't go quietly. But he went. Delia fainted. Literally. Right into the arms of an assistant. My father just stared, eyes wide, lips parted, nothing to say. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but I was already walking away. Some things don't need closure. Some doors stay closed, not because you're angry, but because you finally understand. They were never built for you in the first place. People still talk about it. The scandal, the takeover, the headlines that called it bold, ruthless, shocking. But no one ever says the truth. That I didn't do it for attention. That I didn't do it out of hate. I did it because I was never given a seat. So I built the table instead. Under my leadership, Weston Comer became something new, transparent, lean, human. We stripped away the rot and made room for roots to grow again. I set up scholarships in my mother's name, quiet ones, for girls. Like me. Girls who are underestimated, unheard, unseen. Girls who dream in silence and fight in spreadsheets. Tasha says I look different now. Calmer. She told me, "You used to carry their rejection like a scar. Now, it's armor." And she's right. They'll talk about the scandal. They'll call it dramatic. But what they'll never say is that I begged them to love me because I didn't. I outgrew the need to be chosen. I didn't rise for revenge. I rose because they left me no other choice.